field of ministry, education, and canon law, and it'll probably raise more questions and perhaps an argument or two rather than give answers. A few years ago, I was on a flight from London to Dallas, traveling with Bishop Donald McKeown and a few others to a youth conference in Texas. Traveling in clerics, as I arrived at my aisle seat and nodded at my fellow traveller, the response was, "Oh, you're one of those who indoctrinate children." As you can imagine, the feeling of this is going to be a long 7-hour flight came to mind. But I sat down beside the man and, pretending not to hear his opening remarks, I introduced myself. "Hello, hope you are well," only again to be faced by, "Are you a Catholic priest? You indoctrinate children, don't you?" I won't give the details of the in-flight experience. It wasn't quite entertainment. But after the initial shock, over the next 7 hours, Aubrey and I talked and shared. We debated and we argued and we listened and we heard each other. It was an educational experience for both of us. And as always, the issue wasn't the issue. By engaging with him rather than ignoring him, and likewise with trying to find common ground, which was the fact that he, like my uncle, was a carpenter, I came to learn of the tragic story of a young boy growing up in a commune run by a cult, only to be expelled by the group because he wanted to study at university. And now, some years later, with his siblings, he was returning to their original home to challenge the group of parents about issues of financial, domestic, mental, and sexual abuse. This was an experience that ended with Aubrey asking me to read his 2-minute speech and his accolade to my bishop. And it really made me reflect on how is Catholic education understood within and outside the church community. For Aubrey, it was perceived as indoctrination. And in recent times, even for ourselves, challenges have been posed. Headlines were made just a few months ago when interventions were made on President Higgins's comments on the Late Late Show. The concerns raised that current legislation would cause difficulty for remaining Catholic schools after divestment, and then the decision of parents to homeschool their children because they're not sure of the commitment of a school community to Catholic education. And of course, these are amplified all the more by the many legacy issues that are yet to be addressed. And yet, we have to give some positive reflection on the contribution of the Church towards education in Ireland at all levels, especially within the focus context of Catholic education provision. The verb indoctrinate, according to the Oxford Dictionary, means to force someone to accept a particular belief or set of beliefs and not allow them to consider any others. On the other hand, the same dictionary defines educate as to teach somebody about something or how to do something. So the challenge demanded for us is, how do we understand the teaching mission of the Church that generations have committed themselves to over the centuries? What or where does freedom and truth fall into the conversations in life that allow people not to be insular or indoctrinated? Can the pursuit offered by Catholic education allow for the human being to grow and develop, to respond and flourish in a holistic way, in a faith-filled way for those who desire, and yet also give the same hope to those who do not believe? This call of the Church's mission is best summed up in the searching journey of St. Augustine, ever ancient, ever new. Because the Christian believer lives in a particular time and place in which dialogue occurs between faith and culture. In the midst of this dialogue, the individual develops and grows holistically, formed by the influences around them. These influences include the family, the church community, and the society. This formation opens the believer to the reality of God in their life, so that they come to realize that their journey brings them into communion with God and with others, manifested in the salvation that is offered by Jesus Christ. This means that although the response to faith is a personal choice, it has a public and communal aspect. Succinctly summed up in the words of Pope Benedict XVI when he says, "Catholic education is the highway which leads new generations to see others as their brothers and sisters with whom they are called to journey and work together, so that all will feel that they are living members of the one human family from which no one is to be excluded. It's in this process of formation that the sphere of Catholic education plays a significant role, because it offers a distinct environment for humanity to reflect afresh on its condition amidst the realities of life. While Catholic education is an integral part of the missionary endeavour of the Catholic Church, it is realised in a specific way through Catholic schools. The mission entrusted to the Church by Christ was to proclaim the gospel to all the nations. And in responding to this call, the Church has consistently affirmed her right to found schools in order to educate her subjects and others. As a result of the existence of Catholic schools, the Church assists parents to actively seek education for their children who respond to the promise made at the sacrament of baptism to bring their children up in the ways of the faith. In this way, various agents participate in the multifaceted environment of the Catholic school as parents, teachers, and church authority work together to spread the gospel in living time and place. Canon 800 of the Code of Canon Law states that the Church has the right to establish and direct schools of any discipline, type, and level. Further, the Christian faithful are to foster Catholic schools, assisting in their establishment and maintenance according to their means. This is very much has been affirmed by the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26, that speaks, firstly, that everyone has the right to education. Secondly, that education shall be directed towards the full development of the human personality, that it shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial, or religious groups. And thirdly, parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that should be given to their children. So this right is given a response in Canon 795 of the Church's Code, stating that since true education must strive for complete formation of the human person that looks to his or her final end, as well as to the common good of societies, children and youth are to be nurtured in such a way that they are able to develop their physical, moral, and intellectual talents harmoniously, acquire a more perfect sense of responsibility and right use of freedom, and are formed to participate actively in social life. So certainly this would challenge any idea of Catholic education indoctrinating rather than educating. Of course, the history of Catholic education is a living story, as schools have been founded and directed by the Christian faithful down through the generations, in particular by diocesan bishops and members of religious institutes. It has been in these environments that laymen and women have worked in partnership with priests and religious, contributing to the formation of young people in the ways of the gospel, so that, animated by the spirit and witness of faith, these same young people may be dynamic citizens in the world and promote the common good. In the midst of this educational vision, there are many rights and duties afforded to competent ecclesiastical authority in the sphere offered by the current Code of Canon Law, as well as in the law of civil jurisdictions, which are worth reflecting on, especially at this juncture in the history of Ireland. Education, and in particular the role of the Catholic Church in education at all levels, has been a topic of intense debate and discussion in our country, north and south, especially over the past 10 years. The urgency of such a debate has been heightened by the growing cultural and religious pluralism in our society. A particular issue has been with regard to the new societal, economic, demographic, and cultural factors, and calling the educational system of both jurisdictions to respond to the issues that arise. It is a complex and challenging context, and this has been acknowledged by the Irish bishops, albeit some 13 years ago, in their document, A Vision for Catholic Education in Ireland, where new questions are prompted and calls for new answers are to be given. For many things remain. Even in 2021, approximately 89% of the primary schools in the Republic are Catholic schools. 700 post-primary schools, of which a significant percentage have church patronage, are a share in governance. In Northern Ireland, there are 90 Catholic post-primary schools, 358 primary schools, 31 nursery schools, and 2 special schools. And interestingly, since 2016, in the Republic of Ireland, only 8 schools have been divested from either the Catholic Church or the Church of Ireland. And there are responses to be made. What about the limited alternative choices for educating children of other faiths and none? The erroneous understanding of the nature of Catholic education, the specific argument that faith schools have contributed to social and political issues, in particular with regard to sectarianism in Northern Ireland, and indeed the argument by many that religious faith is a private matter and has no place in the public sphere of life, especially in education. But in time, hopefully, any process of review will have a significant and positive effect on the notion of Catholic education as it functions in Ireland of today, where a particular revision of the way that the Church's mission of proclaiming the gospel is fulfilled in Catholic schools. Surely our hope would be that Catholic schools will be reorientated to the purpose of fostering a commitment to critical thinking and creativity, which is the heartbeat of any living tradition. As the bishops say, Catholic schooling as an expression of just such a living tradition. For in respecting the needs of a modern society, the Church is called to respond to the choice of parents to send their children to Catholic schools to be educated. Since this choice is made because of the specific nature of the Catholic education offered, those involved in these schools are invited to confidently affirm this nature by their word, their action, and by their witness. Therefore, alongside teachers, parents, and pupils, competent ecclesiastical authority must be encouraged to engage in a process to review what do we understand as a Catholic school, as well as how this is played out in the world of today. It is within this context that competent ecclesiastical authority, namely bishops and religious superiors who have patronage of our schools, must fulfil the duties and the rights afforded to them in civil law and the Code of Canon Law with respect to the protection of the rights and the duties of Christ's faithful. This calls for a new clarity to be discovered of what do we mean by Catholic education? What is the relationship between Catholic education and religious formation? And ultimately, how can this Catholic education system form young people for living in the world and as members of the Church, not having been indoctrinated, but having been educated for freedom? This calls then for discussion and respectful conversation rather than heated argument, for a hopeful dialogue, perhaps on some of the following. Within Catholic schools themselves, concerning the nature of the school, the authority of the diocesan bishop and his trustees, and the relationship between the competent ecclesiastical authority and staff. Within the Christian community, the question around the relationship between the parish and the school, as well as identifying issues that arise in family life. Finally, within society itself, what about the conversation with civil authorities? What about the idea of liberty for the Church to act within the education sphere, and also to consider what is shared between Catholic schools and others? Because it is only in this hopeful dialogue that we can then identify what is to be legitimately and praised about Catholic education. Because it is in these schools in 2021, among families and parish communities, that the rubber of faith hits the road of life. And so, as a Dominican, I can only but finish a quote with, "This will help that our young people be formed, to paraphrase St. Catherine of Siena, that the world might be set on fire."
Thank you so much for starting off our panel this morning. And as you said, we are left with those questions, almost hopeful questions as you put it yourself. Thank you so much. I would now like to introduce Dr. Daniel O'Connell and Dr. Kate Liffey with their presentation, "The Primacy of Love That Impels Us Towards Universal Communion. Can this be an organising principle for Catholic schools?" And just to remind you that if you would like to put your questions in the chat feature, I can pose them on your behalf when the presentations are finished.
Let me just get that. Can you see that presentation there?
Yes. Yep, that's
okay. So Kate, so maybe we introduce ourselves. My name is Dan O'Connell and I'm a lecturer in Mary Immaculate College and I teach there in the area of religious education.
My name is Kate Liffey. I'm working with CEIST and I'll explain who CEIST are shortly. And I'm a religious education teacher by training. So you're very welcome to our short presentation. Just to maybe introduce CEIST first. CEIST is the single largest trustee of Catholic post-primary schools in Ireland. It was established in May 2007 and represents or carries on the tradition of 5 religious congregations: the Sisters of the Christian Retreat, the Sisters of Mercy, the Daughters of Charity, the Presentation Sisters, and the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart, the MSCs. I suppose in the work that we're doing, myself and Dan, what we're attempting to do is represent the Catholic tradition in terms of animating and integrating Catholic education. And I think it follows on particularly well from Father Peter's presentation, because in a sense what Dan and I are trying to do through this piece of research is give practical expression to some of the ideas that you've actually expressed there, Peter, particularly around dialogue. And the work that we've done has centred on work with 12 principals using semi-structured group interviews. And just maybe to say a little bit around that meeting point for principals between theology and education. It's interesting to note two important developments in the general educational landscape in Ireland in the last, say, 5 years. The first is the document produced by the Department of Education looking at our schools equality framework for post-primary schools. And in that document, it talks about the importance of providing principals and for principals having opportunities to engage in reflective practice. It talks about this as a discipline for school leaders that will develop awareness by regularly questioning their own practice through personal and collaborative reflection. And what that looks like in Catholic schools is obviously and should be different to what it looks like in, for example, ETB schools or state schools. That's the first development. Another interesting development is an increasing recognition within, for example, the ETB sector, which represents state schools, of the importance ethos plays in, I suppose, the provision of quality education. So that relationship between ethos and education generally, and as the ethos in particular as a driver for excellence. So in terms of that dialogue piece between education and theology, I think in our work with the 12 principals, we were very keen to, I suppose, present to them a way of seeing where their work as professionals, as leaders within Catholic schools, within CEIST schools, how that work intersects with and engages with a theological frame of reference. So over to you, Dan.
Yeah, it's there. Okay. So we decided we met with the principals once, and we had 2 parts. One was to look at the thing of ethos, and we talked about look at discussion of Catholic education with the principles of intercession, ethos, and Catholic education. And the second was to propose a principle that we thought might help and articulate something about the purpose of Catholic education in a way that makes sense in the life of the experience of staff and principals in schools. So we asked this question, what's your visceral reaction to the word Catholic? Just straight like that. And if they could answer it in 3 words. And the principals then said to us words like this, and I bunched the first bunch under impact. If you're like, what's the impact of Catholicism for these principles? So they thought family, challenge, community, belonging, identity, guidance, moral compass, inclusivity, care, compassion, love for all, open to all religions and none, responsible, and values. So they're like lots of words there that kind of impact on the lived experience of people's faith. This bunch of words came, I framed them under the word horizon. If you like, they were about grounding, tradition, conservative background, spirituality, universal faith, and inherent. And then the last, one person said the word God. Of all the words that were used, one person said God, and one other person mentioned church and Eucharist, but they said it in a way that I feel I should say these 2 words, not that they meant that much to that particular participant. So it's just curious that while these people are very grounded in the tradition in many, many ways, the language used wasn't terribly explicit with religious references. And then, if this will carry on from here. Yeah. Kate, will you take the next part about decisions and ethos?
So we were very keen to explore with the, we were very keen to explore with the 3 groups of 4 principals in these semi-structured interviews. We were very keen to explore how they viewed their own decision-making processes. And I suppose there was a sense within the group that decision-making is often subconscious. And because of that, it comes from a space rooted in values and rooted in beliefs. And there was a sense within that, and this was a far more difficult question for them to answer in many ways, but there was a sense, as one principal put it, I think you're doing it all the time. I think it's your values. It comes from your beliefs, and it's around your choices you make and decisions. So an understanding that decision making about the big things in particular come from that value space. Another put it this way, I feel if we are coming from a place that is based on these values, that big decisions actually aren't decisions at all, because you kind of know what is the right thing. And another principle put it that actually the big decisions are not the problems, it's the smaller decisions that cause them, the sleepless nights. So to you, Dan.
Then they talked about some challenges faced as principals regarding ethos. So one said, it seems to be a challenge to present Catholic schools as inclusive. How can you call yourself inclusive and your traditions, your dogma, your whatever actually exclude certain groups of your very community? Oops, sorry. Hugely challenging. And to honor the Catholic faith and be true to the Catholic faith in the school, and yet at the same time know that you are hurting the very people you purport to love. And a number of principals talked about this difficulty with the issue of RSE, relationship to sexuality education, that there's a real challenge of minding and caring for the person while also trying to be true to the tradition as understood by the principals. Another 2 principals talked about the challenge of losing numbers in their schools to other secondary schools in the area that are not Catholic, and that these children are actually the children of past pupils of these schools. And others talked about the challenge of providing for religious education in their school, while others might say, look, why are we doing that? Could we not put on extra maths or different subjects? So the proposal that we suggested to the principals as a way of trying to articulate what it means to be Catholic that makes sense to their lives was, we took a phrase from Fratelli Tutti, or drawn from there, a love that impels towards communion. And we wondered if that might be a principle that would animate and integrate the life in Kesh School. So a love with a capital L refers to God, that God is love, as in the first letter of John, that out of that relationship with God comes a drive towards communion, building relationships. So it's rooted in Fratelli Tutti. And in the presentation, we spoke a lot about the reality of how the word is fracturing and fragmenting, as can be seen very easily when we look at the news, whether that's politically or socially or sexually, if you like, the whole issue of gender and sexual orientation, environmentally, in all kinds of ways. We're familiar with this. And then we're asking the question, given this reality in the world today, how do cash schools respond to this changing reality? And then we looked at the vision in the Charter for cash schools that speaks about a compassionate and just society inspired by the life and teaching of Jesus Christ. And out of that, then we talked about the teaching of Jesus in Luke 15, the three parables that I'm sure you're familiar with, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son, and how all these stories traditionally have been framed as lost and found stories. But Ron Rollihiser, the Canadian theologian, frames them a little bit differently. And he says they're not so much about being lost and found, but about returning to wholeness. That the lost sheep, the 100, is a whole number in Hebrew. And it's about the one being returned to the 99, and it becoming whole again. Not just being found, but the restoration of unity. The lost coin, as you know, 10, where Rollihiser says that's a whole number in the Hebrew tradition. And if you lose one, you've only got 9. And Rollihiser tells a story about he's Canadian, so we talk about Thanksgiving, he lives in America now. We could talk about Christmas, how if you had 10 children, and at Christmas, only 9 of them were there for their Christmas dinner, and how you'd have an empty place. If you were the parent, you couldn't settle because one is missing. Until maybe your child rings on Christmas Day and you make it up. And then, if you like, you're back together. The 10 are back together. There's wholeness again. Prodigal son story. The father's aim is to get both boys into the house, into heaven, if you like. And so for Rollihiser, he's saying that it's about whole numbers here. And the thrust in these stories from Jesus is towards wholeness, unity, and completeness. And Rollihiser is saying that Catholicism isn't a whole number, a little bit echoing the word what Mark Patrick was saying earlier on. Catholicism isn't a whole number. Protestantism isn't a whole number. Same with Hinduism, Islam. And that what we're talking about is everyone, or as Jonathan Sachs talks about, all of us together, which is the thrust of Fratelli Tutti. So then we're saying, in light of the teaching of Jesus from Luke 15, how do we think about things now? To the principles that we talked about, Pope Francis called to become places where there's a culture of encounter and dialogue. So not just proximity, where people are proximate to each other, but actually a culture of encounter, really meeting, seeing, hearing, appreciating the other, and perhaps being changed in light of that dialogue or encounter. Perhaps that's something that needs to deepen and widen its presence in our schools. We talked a little bit about this book by Sharon Parks and others, Common Fire, Lives of Commitment in a Complex World. These researchers looked at people around the world who had a commitment towards the common good, and they asked, how do you have this commitment to something bigger, wider, deeper than yourself? And they came up with 5 characteristics. One of them was they all had a mentor in their lives, all these participants. But a characteristic that was surprising to the researcher was they all had a transformative, constructive encounter with otherness. A little bit cumbersome, a transformative and constructive encounter with otherness. I.e., they met somebody outside their tribe. And in the meeting of the other, it was transformative, but also constructive. You could imagine meeting somebody outside your tribe, perhaps maybe a traveler or somebody who's settled or somebody who's gay or straight or whatever. And it just perpetuates old stereotypes. So it's not constructive. But they're saying that how do we facilitate, foster these occasions where there can be the possibility for a transformative, constructive encounter with otherness? It's what Pope Francis talks about all the time. So then we were saying to the principals about Catholic schools, can we do more of this in light of Fratelli Tutti and in light of the fragmentation that's happening in the world? At the end of the presentation, the principals, the idea was received very positively, made sense to them. One said, I just find that deeply moving as an idea, as a concept, as a feeling, because to me, that's what it's all about. It chimed with people's care for the vulnerable and the essential task of building community. It also was a source of animation for some of the participants. One said, I suppose just to say, like, I think it's fantastic what you've done, because I suppose for all of us, that ethos, vision that we live out every day, sometimes it's very difficult to kind of have that conversation with staff. We're doing it every day anyway, but finding the language that's accessible to everybody, including staff, I think that can be very tricky. So I really like the approach you took. But what about staff? So some principals felt, I think this approach would appeal to staff. Some other principals said, I think it would appeal to half of my staff. One person we spoke to said, I don't think it would appeal to a principal that they know. So there's, as you know yourselves, I'm sure, there's a range of views on that. It was interesting, some of the participants felt like the word communion doesn't really help because it's very associated with mass, our preparation for Holy Communion. And most felt it's not a helpful word. It's a religious word, communion, a love that impels towards communion. So perhaps Kate and I need to think that through a little bit more. The beginning of the phrase, a love, that it's out of experience with God, impels us towards communion. Two people wondered if this was too abstract, love, that God is love. While others, 4 other people liked the idea that it doesn't gender God. It's not always the he. They refer to God as something wider, deeper, bigger than that. So let me finish up. What does it mean? What are we learning from this proposal, a love that impels towards communion? The idea was received favorably by the principals, which is great. And we're trying to sort of bring that meeting of theology and education together. And so this was a good first start. But it's a conversation that needs to be pushed much wider in Catholic education circles. We need to change the word communion, and we need to broaden the conversation to the different patron bodies and organizations of Catholic education in Ireland. We need to be more explicit, I think, about the environmental issues, and what's needed is CPD for staff. That's just, but it's how we do that in a way that makes sense to their life, personally and professionally. So let me finish there. That's Kate and I's presentation. So let me finish sharing the screen.